those who are joining us for this spotlight session. Today, co-hosted by the Women's Major Group, the LGBTQI Stakeholder Group, and Global Policy Forum. We have a wonderful slate of speakers today to discuss meaningful, effective, and inclusive partnerships for gender equality. So I know you're all in for a treat. We'll have 2 rounds of questions for our speakers, followed by a Q&A portion. So please post your questions in the chat on the event platform, and we'll collect them as we go. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to our moderator for this session, Rosa Lizarde, the Global Director of the Feminist Task Force, which is a global coalition advocating for gender equality to end poverty. And Rosa is also a co-convener of the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development. So over to you, Rosa.
Thank you so much, Elena. Good afternoon and good evening to all, and welcome to the UN ECOSOC Partnership Forum Spotlight session on meaningful, effective, and inclusive partnerships for gender equality, co-sponsored by the Women's Major Group and the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, and Intersex Stakeholder Group, also known by its acronym LGBTI Group, and the Global Policy Forum. This session will provide a discussion of the current partnership systems in place at the United Nations and what measures are needed to support more meaningful partnerships for promoting gender equality that are effective, inclusive, balanced, and accountable, and that can deliver on the ambitions of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Gender equality is acknowledged as being at the core of the 2030 Agenda, cutting across the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. However, among the SDGs, Goal 5 has been seen as the most regressive during COVID-19. While the effects of the pandemic are deepening inequalities, increasing gender-based violence, and school dropouts, women and girls and all their diversity remain at the forefront of the response to COVID-19, with the burden of care work exponentially increasing. Recovering from the effects of the pandemic justly in a transformative and sustainable manner, advancing progress on SDG 5 through effective, meaningful, equal, and inclusive partnerships will be vital. And while partnerships are being given increasing attention throughout the UN system and other intergovernmental fora, the definition of partnerships has been narrowing, from the introduction of public-private partnerships to newer concepts such as multi-stakeholderism and network multilateralism. The private sector in particular has been gaining increased access to and influence in many policymaking spaces. At the same time, efforts to democratize these spaces and to be inclusive of all stakeholders appear to be leaving behind civil society, specifically the most marginalized organizations, including feminist and grassroots women-led organizations and movements from the global South. This session will discuss these factors as well as look at power imbalances and lack of accountability in the way partnerships are currently being approached, and what learnings we can expand on and other takeaways. I will now open the floor to our 4 speakers, who will have between 2 to 4 minutes in the first round of questions and answers. We will be working with a tight program, so I apologize ahead of time if I will need to interrupt and issue a reminder to begin wrapping up your comments at minute 3. So now I will invite Ambassador Buenrostro from Mexico to address our session. Ambassador Buenrostro has been a career diplomat since 1990, Currently, she serves as the Deputy Permanent Representative of Mexico to the United Nations in New York. Prior, she served as ambassador to Austria with concurrent accreditation to Slovenia and Slovakia. Ambassador, thank you for joining us. Muchas gracias.
My pleasure.
Our question to you is, Mexico's support as the Vice President of ECOSOC in 2021, an inclusion of civil society focusing on gender equality and human rights, as well as accountability and partnerships, has been important for our engagement in the ECOSOC spaces. Could you elaborate on the views of Mexico regarding the inclusion of civil society and other voices in all their diversity, focusing on gender equality and human rights?
Rosa, it's a pleasure. Can you hear me? It's a pleasure
Yes.
to be with you this afternoon. I'm taking part in a very important event. What I can share with you is that Mexico is deeply committed to the realization of gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls in all their diversity. My country reaffirms its commitment to place women and girls' rights at the heart of our diplomacy, which has been guided by our feminist foreign policy. So we are aware that a global recovery in the years to come, the achievement of the 2030 agenda, and the full implementation of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action will only be possible through gender-responsive policies at the international, at the national, and the local levels. So to this end, the meaningful participation of civil society, women's and youth organizations, activists, and the private sector through inclusive and transparent partnerships is essential. There's no other way. Multi-stakeholder platforms can provide for sure an important input to the development, implementation, and the evaluation of gender-responsive policies. But joint decisions are essential in providing various and several perspectives, as you can imagine, and that is what will help us to recognize and identify common challenges to seek joint solutions. We have also witnessed in recent years a pushback from some governments to impede the full participation of civil society, including women's and LGBTI organizations, in matters that really affect them. So unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic has also somehow hindered the inclusion of civil society within the framework of the United Nations. And this we cannot accept. It's unacceptable, really. Mexico looks forward to seeing the renewed and enhanced participation going forward because it's really essential. And we recognize that the same systems of patriarchy, of negative social norms and gender stereotypes and expectations that oppress women also keep LGBTI persons marginalized and excluded. So my country has a legal framework that prohibits all forms of discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. So for us, the engagement of civil society and grassroots organizations remains crucial to mobilize communities and to push the inclusion of diverse voices throughout all policy-making efforts. We recognize as well the key role that the private sector plays in advancing gender equality. And through measurable goals and targets, companies can be accountable under inclusive programs, and there are many good practices that we know on how they are integrating gender transformative policies. Finally, as part of the UN LGBTI core group, my country, Mexico, will continue to work on the elimination of all forms of discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, and is also committed to ensure that these diverse voices are provided a platform and are taken into account in our work at the United Nations.
Thank you so much for those words. I think we will be having a Q&A after this, where we might pick up on some of those points. Thank you so much. We will turn now to hear from an activist who has been working on the ground, Cham Perez, if you can join us. Cham Perez is the Executive Director of the Center for Women's Resources in the Philippines and a focal point of Asia Pacific Women's Legal Defense Feminist Development Justice Program Organization Committee, and works directly with farmers, workers, urban poor, and young women on issues of development and human rights. Cham? Thank you for joining us. Can you turn on your microphone and your video if you can? Thank you. Hi, Cham. Thanks for joining us. Cham, during the COVID-19 pandemic, how have you pushed for development at the grassroots level with your partners in the community? And also, how have the partnerships with government impacted women on the ground?
Thank you, Rosa, for that. Let me begin by saying that the COVID-19 pandemic greatly exacerbated the impacts of underlying structural and systemic inequalities experienced by women. Losses in jobs, wages, lack of social protection. Women are even having difficulties accessing food. In Asia and the Pacific, more than 375 million people faced hunger in 2020. And because of this, women are at the forefront of responding through mutual aid initiatives, such as in the Philippines, community kitchens and community pantries, which are actually a strong indictment of the failures of some governments to provide for the needs of the people. But we know that these are temporary solutions. So we continue to organize ourselves, work together to demand living wages, substantial social protection, and other urgent public health and socioeconomic demands. We continue to demand for transparency and accountability because our experiences during the pandemic provided us with so much more reasons to challenge the many development policies and partnerships that our government is pursuing for decades. That kind of partnership, public-private partnership that favors businesses and corporations over women and people's rights and welfare. And this is what actually keeps women from surviving the pandemic, let alone achieving sustainable development. You know, in the name of progress and COVID recovery, some governments, including ours, continue with its massive infrastructure program, partnering with corporations, taking in a lot of loans from IFIs and the rich countries. They want to build more special economic zones where businesses, especially foreign investors, will get a lot of incentives while workers get below living wages. In rural areas, the kind of development they are pursuing is promoting corporate plantations and large-scale mining and energy project that displaces and kills the lives and livelihood of farmers, indigenous peoples, and it even harms the environment. And these kinds of development policies and partnerships are the kind of development that we never wanted in the first place.
Thank you so much, Cham. Now we're going to turn to Emilia Reyes. Hi, Emilia. If you
Hola,
can
Rosa.
show yourself. Emilia Reyes is a civil society expert with in-depth knowledge of global sustainable development and gender issues. Emilia is currently the Program Director of Policy and Budgets for Equality and Sustainable Development at Equidad de Genero, and is also a co-convener of the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development. Emilia, we know that the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development has been one of the civil society co-leads of the Action Coalition on Economic Justice and Rights. What does meaningful and effective partnership mean from a civil society point of view at the generation equality process? And perhaps you can also include, what accountability issues you might be facing within that process.
Yes, thank you, Rosa, and thank you everybody for joining us. Just say that Rosa Lizarde is also a co-lead along my organization in the Action Coalition for Economic Justice and Rights on behalf of the Women's Working Group. And I just would say, start with asking me about, corporate capture of the UN and corporate global imperialism steroids, without saying that we will have precisely multi-stakeholder partnerships. This is a very perverse setting, and we've seen this in the experience of especially on the Action Coalition on Economic Justice and Rights. We've seen actually that there's a tension between wanting to bringing all of the actors to the table, some who are duty bearers like states, and some that have a proper mandate like the UN and UN agencies, and on the other end, private sectors who may have funding, and also philanthropies who may hold a large saying in most of the larger debates in our time, for instance, in the issue of vaccines. But the tension comes when it is not about, tokenizing our agenda or tokenizing the actors. It is really about when all of the tensions of power come to play. So we've seen that it seems like for the other action coalitions, there has been a willingness to come to common floors based on the demands of the feminist movement. It hasn't been so in our Economic Justice and Rights Action Coalition, precisely because of the demands of actors like the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development, or regarding the global democratic architecture, equity in vaccines, debt cancellation, regulation in trades, the trip waiver, tax justice, and everything that is meaningful precisely to manage a global order. So to us, this is something that it's been an experience that has been tiresome. We are still in the tension of achieving this type of demands, but we just wanted to say very clearly that the notion of the Generation Equality Forum was born precisely with the intention of hearing the feminist movement voice and delivering on that. And it so happens that precisely with the larger tensions of these actors sitting at the table with us, it's where everything stops. So this is our warning from the point of view of the feminist movement. And as you were saying, Rosa, in the terms of accountability, it's still something that is being built. Because on the one hand, there are commitments, financial commitments that are not necessarily allocated to those women's and feminist movements on the ground. And on the other, we really need to have accountability on the portfolios of all of those actors who are saying, well, I'm giving money to gender equality. We want to see that they're stopping, they're doing no harm, these corporations on the ground, that they're really fulfilling their responsibilities on the social and environmental impacts, and that they're really ensuring a transformative gender equality, and not just saying we have women on the board, or we're just giving micro loans to women so that they get into further debts and exacerbate a larger global cycle. I'll leave it here. I'm very eager to hear what our other colleagues are going to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emilia. Your passion is certainly coming across, and thank you for those points. I think what we'll do is just go do another round and lead off with another question for Ambassador Buenrostro Maceo on the generation equality process. Ambassador, Mexico has been one of the leading countries on the generation equality process, having co-sponsored one of the main events, the conference in March. Could you provide some reflections following the Generation Equality Forum, primarily on how the process has served as a means to form partnerships? What were the successes and challenges, including on the issue of accountability in partnerships?
Well, thank you very much again, Rosa, for the question. What I would like to share with you is that the Generation Equality Forum has been a very good example of a successful and innovative new generation partnerships. Of course, it has not been perfect. Of course, it needs to evolve. Of course, it needs to deliver very good results. And we are not still there, of course. But as you know, it was a civil society-led global gathering for gender equality convened by UN Women and co-hosted by my country, Mexico and France last year, with an action-oriented agenda and co-created by multiple stakeholders based on partnership and solidarity focused solutions. And they were created to address the resource gaps in the implementation of the Beijing Declaration and the Platform for Action. The forum, as you know, and you will recall, brought together a wide array of stakeholders from civil society, governments, the private sector, of course, international financial institutions, parliaments from around the world, trade unions, media, philanthropy, artists, academia, social influencers, and more participants in a common agenda and joint action for gender equality. It center stage the leadership, the activism, and aspirations of feminist activists and young people to achieve gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls worldwide by 2030. I have already heard, from civil society. I was listening eagerly and carefully to what has been said. I can tell again that it has not been perfect, that it still needs to work out on the results and the deliverables. But as an important success, I would say that by leveraging multi-stakeholder partnerships, the forum launched a set of concrete and time-bound actions within the period of 5 years, and we are at the very beginning, and announced ambitious investments and policies. We have to say that the money and the resources that were announced there were not necessarily in terms of money or in terms of funds, but it was also in terms of concrete policies and other means to achieve irreversible progress towards gender equality and focusing on women and girls who face multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination. So since the very beginning, during the preparatory process leading to the forum in Mexico City first and then in Paris, with the full support of UN Women, a new model of mobilization, of coordination, of inclusion, solidarity, and sustained engagement of a wide range of stakeholders with specific roles and responsibilities was established. And this was very unique. That clearly contributed to gather a wide support for the forum at an early stage and later at the meetings in Mexico City and in Paris. To mention some challenges, and there are not only some, there are many, I would say that credible and transparent decision-making processes among stakeholders were not always an easy task, but in our case, the outcomes of the forum have demonstrated that it was worth trying. So without any doubt, political support and commitment at the highest level were an essential component for a successful result too. And looking ahead, it will certainly be for the implementation and accountability of the commitments. This last point is definitely a challenge that we all partners together will have to follow up to ensure transparency and effectiveness in the way commitments are implemented. My country will continue to call for a multi-stakeholder approach in the definition of the global challenges and in the identification of the solutions as part of an enhanced and renewed multilateralism that places gender equality at the heart of its collective action. Just to finalize, yesterday we met with the executive director of UN Women. We agreed to do a very close follow-up on the implementation, on the challenges, and on the many good things as well from Generation Equality Forum. So thank you, Rosa.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for that information. Let me circle back and invite our next presenter, Andre Rivas. Andre Rivas is an Argentinian activist for family diversity and LGBTQ and human rights organizations. They are the founder and president of Familias Diversas of Argentina, an NGO dedicated to achieve real equality for rainbow families. They are the co-chair of the Civil Society of Argentina in the ERC Outright International UN Fellow 2021. Andre, good to have you here.
Thank you, Rosa.
Okay. Hola, there you are. Great, Andre, an important part of gender equality is the inclusion of LGBTQI plus populations, of course. In partnerships on gender equality, is this always the case? How do the actions of governments affect this inclusion or exclusion?
Well, intersectionality and collective work for inclusion of the LGBTI population is necessary in order to truly achieve gender equality. And I would like to give you an example of partnership. We team up with an NGO of the anti-corruption agenda here in Argentina to study for the first time the impacts of corruption on LGBTI community and to explore the intersections between the community movement and the anti-corruption agenda in Latin America. To mention, for example, two key findings in our report are the first, the cycle of invisibility around our identities is reinforced when corruption takes form of institutional invisibilization. What happens here is that this strongly discourages LGBTI people from presenting complaints to public institutions because it establishes the fear as a way of life, fear to report, fear of being murdered, fear of having to migrate, escaping threats, and of course, fear of suffer outing. And the circle of invisibility increases also impunity. Experts agree that the regulatory frameworks and anti-corruption programs do not usually explicitly include LGBTI plus people, nor do they address the differential and highly corruption in our community. They also do not contain specific protection mechanisms for us. Since institutional violence and abuses of power are the main tenor of daily violence against our communities, it is urgent that policies aim to, in the first place, make visible the vulnerability of LGBT plus people, and then propose the necessary legislative reforms that enable these abuses to be dismantled. So, building an anti-corruption agenda with LGBTI perspective demands a collective work and, of course, the involvement of authorities. I would like to share 3 recommendations that the government can make. First, create a regulatory frameworks appropriate to LGBT plus human rights, focus on combating the structural causes of discrimination and the differentiated impact of corruption on LGBTI plus people. 2, ensure plural, representative, and open participation of LGBT community and LGBT civil society in the design of the anti-corruption and transparency policies. And 3rd, produce, collect, and manage disaggregated data with a human rights perspective. I think that it is a great way to include LGBTI plus population with an intersectional point of view. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andre. I really appreciate that. Let's turn now to Cham. And Cham, what does meaningful, inclusive, and effective partnerships mean on the grassroots level? And what are the roles and realities of the women's human rights defenders within these partnerships?
Rosa, I think for us to make development partnerships meaningful, inclusive, and effective, it necessitates, as we've already said, it necessitates putting women and people's rights at the front and center of discussions and actions, and not the interests of a few. It means recognizing women's collective power, that we are a formidable force that can drive sustainable progress. We need to ensure and invest in these active participations in decision-making processes of us, of those who were whose voices are left behind, of landless farmers, fisher folks, workers, migrants, domestic workers, young people. Because what we see now is that these voices remain unheard or sidelined in favor of, again, other development partners, businesses, and corporations. But as you know, grassroots women, before we engage in spaces in the UN or even with our own government, we go through this process of building our collective knowledge from our experiences. We build our analyses. We even study these UN processes because this is something very far from our realities and experiences on the ground. And you know, pre-pandemic, we even travel thousands of miles hoping to raise our issues in a 2-minute intervention. And sadly, many times we are not even given that opportunity. And even with these virtual spaces, we have the digital divide, differences in time zones. It's still very difficult for grassroots women to access these spaces, let alone be heard, no? But you know what is more alarming is the shrinking civic space that we experience, sadly, from our own government. Many of us, our sisters, women human rights defenders, who were at the forefront of challenging corporate power, who are at the forefront of demanding transparency and accountability. When we start talking and fighting for the kind of development that we want, when we reiterate the need for systemic change, when we claim development justice, we are not just sidelined or not heard. Sadly, we are threatened, harassed. Some are illegally arrested, imprisoned, and some are even killed. So we say that there is no meaningful, inclusive, and effective partnership when rights defenders, especially women, are continuously attacked, just like this.
Thank you so much for that heartfelt presentation about what is happening on the ground to human rights defenders in the Philippines. I want to turn back to Andre at this point and ask you, we know that during the COVID pandemic, with strong advocacy from civil society, good things did happen in Argentina, as important laws were passed on partnerships to assist marginalized populations, such as the abortion law and the Translator Quota. How do you see these laws aid the lives of marginalized groups and support their effective, meaningful, and inclusive participation in public life? And how do these strengthen the partnerships?
Well, the partnership were the main factor to be able to have these laws, really, and the participation of the civil society with a process of a strategy all together and prioritizing the time when we need to press the authorities, put pressure on the in our authorities. For example, the LGBTI plus movement was an important actor working in alliances with the entire feminist movement that came together to achieve the abortion law that include all people with the capacity to gestate. And it is expressly established in the text of the law that was adopted during the pandemic. I would like to mention that the National Campaign for Legal Abortion was formed 50 years ago. So I say this because it took 50 years to achieve the law, and achieving the adherence throughout the country of more than 300 groups, organizations, and personalities linked to the women's movement, human rights organization, the academic, scientific field, health workers, unions, and various social and cultural movements, including rural and education networks, organization of the unemployed, recover factories, student groups also, and of course, the LGBTI movement. Our movement collectively joined in converging on a great diversity of activities and strategy processes of the national campaign, actively promoting them and contributing to the debate and the sanction of the law. This strategy included strongly and tirelessly promoting the enactment of the law during the pandemic. It was a strategy moment to press collectively at a time of public health crisis where women and LGBTI people, because of COVID and because of what COVID showed, that the lack of public policies that do not address the structural causes of violence and inequality enhance our depth and our vulnerability. So after achieving abortion on December of 2020, with this same strategy of collective struggle and taking COVID crisis as an opportunity, as a strategic moment, we pressed the authorities to obtain the Translator Quota Law. And I would like to share what is the Translator Quota Law that we accomplished in Argentina. This law establishes that the trans and non-binary people must hold positions in the national public sector in a proportion of no less than 1% of all public positions. This demand was also historic and had been going on for more than a decade, but was the COVID-19 the opportunity to put pressure? Because I think that what we could achieve is to put pressure in the right moment, addressing the structural causes of discrimination. That was the ones that I mentioned before. We need to address the structural causes of discrimination to really, really achieve gender equality. So I will, sorry, yes, no, now I will say this only, that now we are facing the problem of implementation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andre. Everyone has been very, very good with the time. So a pardon for that. Next, we're going to go to Emilia, and this will be the last question. And then what we'll do is we'll open it up for Q&A from the audience. So Emilia, what do you need as a feminist collective to be participating meaningfully, effectively, and inclusively in multi-stakeholder partnerships, not only in the action coalitions, but also in the broader UN system? And how does this UN system, member states, and the feminist civil society support your efforts?
Thank you so much for this. I just want to say from the start that to our eyes, multilateralism is not networked multi-stakeholderism. And that is something that I really want to say from the get-go. And the second, if you indulge me and I were a character in that women's show promoting consumerism rather than women's human rights, I would just say at this moment, and just like that, the Secretary General, the UN Women, Northern INGOs and networks want a seat at the table in power, but not on a democratic one. And it seems that it is really defining what is happening now. The issue of the multi-stakeholderism is really trying to make a shift towards a table of power, but what they don't see is that that very seductive table of power is not addressing the structural causes, precisely because you have seated at the table those who are the cause of the problems. So I just wanted to commend Mexico on its role on every sort of precisely multilateral spaces in promoting the strengthening of the UN as it is, and trying to bring it to the utmost power, the democratic nature of its process. So we really want to work towards a democratizing the global economic governance and the environmental governance, the gender governance, and this cannot be done when you have an imbalance of power. Because what we see precisely as an example in our Economic Justice and Rights Action Coalition is that they're trying to shut down the voice of the feminist movement. That was the origin of the Generation Equality Forum, to raise the feminist voice. And this is what happens when you pretend that the table is even, but it's not. And we fear, this is why I go to your point, Rosa, we fear that this bet on network multi-stakeholderism, what it's going to do is going to dismantle the UN, because it's going to bring in all of those powerful, let us say, non-democratic powers like the G20, like the G7, like the Paris Club, etc., to like the fossil fuels lobby into the table at the same place where Cham is mobilizing all of those people working on the agricultural fields, the fisheries, or where Andre is mobilizing LGBTI, and they will just get shut at the door as what happens at COP26. So it is a very tricky and seductive space. We do not think that that enhancing the role of the UN cannot be balanced with dialogues with these type of actors that are also needed to be regulated, and they need to pay taxes, and they need to be get whole accountable of their social and environmental impacts, and they need to sit down and say, how can we contribute? But this space cannot replace the ones that we have, that we need to strengthen. So this is a balance that we want as feminists, but also as part of broader social movements. We see that this is a huge moment of regression, especially with our common agenda. We see that many actors are being seduced by this call, just because they say, we're gonna talk on your issues, but we're talking about a bigger picture. And democratizing multilateralism is the most urgent element to address on COVID vaccines, on the pandemic, on the environmental emergencies, and on discrimination as a structural element rather than just an issue of quotas. So I'll just leave it here. I'm very happy to keep on engaging in this dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have about 8 minutes left, which would be about 2 minutes per person. We have one question that came in, actually two, but one that is one we can pose to all the speakers, and that is, how do we ensure to take into consideration intersectionalities as well as context in this discussion? The question is also applicable to persons with disabilities. So I want to go back to Ambassador Buenrostro Maceo, if I can bring you back. And that is a question that has surfaced. If you can address some points on this for about a minute or so, two.
Sure. Thank you, Rosa. I think it's a very important question. In the end, I think that if your priority is intersectionality, you need to consider the context for sure. So you really need to be flexible and open-minded in order to be able to make it work. But it's a matter of, if that is a priority for you, I think that you need to work at all levels to be able to bring the context and the intersectionalities together. So that is important. If you do that with flexibility, with open-minded, I think that you can that you can work it out. But besides this, I would also like to comment on what Emilia has just said. I think that she has posed very important points here. And I just want to say that we really thank you, because the work that you do, your undertakings and your responsibilities and the way in which you see things are extremely important. You know, your feedback and the way you realize things and that you look at them are very, very important and are extremely valuable for us. So I really want to thank you, and we need to keep on working with you because that's a way in which we can do things better. Talking about democratization, for example, of the UN, I think that is a very important point, and what you mentioned, I really take it with me. So I just want to say thank you. We need to have this type of exercise more often, and also what Cham, as you know, she shared with us, you know, especially working in the field where you really get what's really going on. That's also very important and very valuable. So thank you very much again. But again, context and intersectionality is very important.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Fully agree. Having a partner like Emilia who is able to speak out in these spaces and really speak truth to power. And I think that this has been very, very valuable because it's not just within the Generation Equality or Action Coalition space, but it's really system-wide. So thank you so much for making that point and appreciating that. I want to turn to Cham. Cham, the question is there. I mean, you've raised very important points about the challenges that you've been facing on the ground, the challenges that the PPPs present in the prioritization of women and their rights and welfare. And you can speak to this question, or you can also respond to what the ambassador has said, or to what has been said. Cham?
Thank you, Rosa. I think when it comes to intersectionalities and context, if there's anyone who understands intersectionalities and context, better it is the grassroots women and the many marginalized sectors who have long suffered under the global capitalist system, because it is our lived experiences. And the impacts, the experiences that I've shared a while ago, this includes our intersectionalities in our context, and we have been bringing it up and fighting for these in these spaces. So I say, hear us out and take actions on what we have been saying all along. So I think that's it.
Thank you so much, Cham. Let me turn to Andre. Andre, I mean, you can take this question. It's something that you've been working in, living in, and you know, tell us, you know, what do we look to in terms of intersectionalities as well as context?
Well, I want to add to what my colleague said, that, for example, here in Argentina, we have a great legislative framework. But what happened is that in some contexts, for example, in rural contexts, or in the diversity of our territories, as, for example, Cham mentioned recently, the laws or the protocols to implement that laws are not taking into account the diversity of our territories and the distances. For example, if you want to make a complaint in rural spaces where if the justice is there. So we need to take this into account when we want to make the achievement of gender equality. We need to design the policies and the implementation of that policies, considering the diversity and the intersectionality of our population. No, I think that is very important. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andre. And Emilia, we'll give you the last word, and I'll just have one more minute for a little wrap up and thank you. But you can reply to any of those comments, or you can answer the question, or both.
Yes, thank you very much. I always like it to have the final word. Just wanted to say that on the one hand, we need to uphold our women's human rights instruments, and in the larger extent, our human rights mandate within the UN. So that should be our guiding spot. And any multi-stakeholder space cannot replace that. Even the interesting effort that has been done by Mexico, by France, by other member states, including by the feminist movement who have engaged in that, we treasure it as an experience, and we want to see it thriving, but it cannot replace our Beijing, our Cairo, and the larger mandate of CEDAW and all of those bodies, and we want to see them stronger. And this is why our fear of this type of space is taking a hold of the UN, especially with our common agenda. We see that it's a bigger threat when already the UN is being weakened because it doesn't have enough budget. And also member states are trying to struggle with the barriers, for instance, for a TRIPS waiver. And we've seen Mexico being very strong in calling for universal vaccines for all. Just to say, to wrap up, to achieve intersectionality, but also to achieve systemic change, we need to stop giving into the current financial and economic architecture. We need to try to do system change, and we need to reform towards our human rights framework. That will be the way in which we will finally guarantee and ensure women's human rights for all, but also the health of the planet. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You really summarized a lot of the comments that have been mentioned here today. Also, just to highlight that the implementation and monitoring will be key, as mentioned by Mexico, to these processes. Specifically, she was speaking of the generation equality process. Civil society is key, as well as discernment and assessment with UN Women on the follow-up of that. The COVID pandemic continues to impact primarily those marginalized and vulnerable communities, as we heard today. There is certain legislation, progressive legislation, that is helping with LGBTQ plus peoples, as well as in other issues, and also that looking at how we should not give up on the challenges that we are facing within the UN on multilateralism. We look to the UN Charter, and remember, it's we, the peoples, that are front and foremost and core. So to end today, I want to thank you for joining us today. Thank you to all of our speakers. Ambassador, thank you so much. Cham, Andre, and Emilia, thank you. And I also want to acknowledge our coordinators for this session, Shanaz Kimaz, Andrea Vega, and Elena Marmo. Thank you to the Women's Major Group, the LGBTI Stakeholder Group, and the Global Policy Forum. Thank you for joining us for this ECOSOC Partnership Forum on meaningful, effective, and inclusive partnerships for gender equality. Thank you so much. Stay safe, stay healthy, take care.